The Upfield line is a 19-kilometre electrified suburban railway line running directly north of the Melbourne CBD, through the densely populated old suburbs of Brunswick and Coburg, up to the largely industrial suburb of Campbelfield. At first glance, it might seem like there isn't much to the Upfield line, but it does have a very interesting history, including surviving several attempts at closure in the late 20th century. In this video, we're going to work our way along the whole route and chat about some of that history, as well as taking a look at how the line currently operates and the many interesting features you can see along the way. All photographs and footage used in this video are my own, mostly taken over the last 15 years or so. The Upfield line is part of a group of lines called the Northern Group, which are all the yellow lines on the network map. These lines are grouped together operationally because they all share the Northern Tunnel through the underground city loop, which is one of the deep-level tunnels running through the platform 3s at Flagstaff, Melbourne Central and Parliament. The Northern Group runs clockwise around the loop most of the time, except on weekday afternoons when it reverses direction to run anti-clockwise. At Flinders Street Station, where each service technically begins or ends, Northern Group trains use either platform 4 or 5, and at Southern Cross they run through platform 11. The first station out of the CBD is North Melbourne, located in the suburb of West Melbourne. North Melbourne is a busy interchange station with 6 platforms. Upfield line trains mostly run on the East Suburban, which is platforms 1 and 2, but can also use platforms 3 and 4 on the main suburban. The Upfield line branches away from the rest of the Northern Group immediately on the downside of North Melbourne at North Melbourne Junction, passing the disused signal box, which is still standing from back when this area was locally controlled. A quick bit of railway terminology for those not familiar: up means towards the city, down means towards the country. It's easy to remember on this line because it's down towards Upfield, and it's also mostly uphill in the down direction. Got it? After North Melbourne Junction, the line runs past a number of sidings. On the east side of the line is the Arden Street siding, which is not electrified and was once used for goods traffic. Today it's used by V-Line to stable a single train during the day between peak hours. On the other side of the line is the Macaulay Light Repair Centre, which does exactly what it sounds like, performing light maintenance tasks on electric suburban trains. A short distance to the east here is the entrance to the brand new Arden Station, part of the new underground metro tunnel due to open in 2025. The line then passes over its first level crossing, Arden Street, and you can see where some of the sidings once continued here, with their rails still embedded in the crossing. The line then disappears from the satellite view as it heads underneath the CityLink freeway, which runs directly above the line for the next 1,300 metres. Running along the west side of the line here is a cycling path and the Moonee Ponds Creek, which sometimes floods over the path and up near the level of the railway, which is protected by this concrete flood barrier. The freeway here is divided into 2 separate structures, carrying the lanes for each direction, leaving a gap in the middle. This creates an interesting effect when steam specials run on the line, with the smoke rising up directly through the middle of the freeway. The next level crossing is Macaulay Road. An interesting feature here is that Macaulay Road has a second level crossing about 500 metres away at Kensington on the Craigieburn line. If you use a long lens with a decent helping of skill, patience and luck, it is possible to take a photograph with a train on both crossings simultaneously. Or you could do what I did and cheat, combining 2 photos later in Photoshop. Immediately north of Macaulay Road is Macaulay Station, perhaps Melbourne's most depressing station, featuring austere 70s brick buildings nestled in the gloom under the freeway. The first part of this line opened as far as Coburg in 1884, but this station was added a few years later in 1887, originally called Macaulay Road, changing to its current name in 1909. Despite its bleak appearance, Macaulay does have one interesting story to tell. In 1943, during a wartime aerobatic display aimed at boosting public morale was considerably unboosted when one of the aircraft involved lost control and crashed right next to Macaulay Station, narrowly missing a departing train and killing both pilots. There's a plaque commemorating the event just near the level crossing, which is behind a wire fence, but appears to be well looked after. Continuing north, the line begins to climb away from the creek, passing over Racecourse Road and Tram Route 57 on a steel truss bridge, finally emerging from under the freeway and arriving into the next station, Flemington Bridge. This is a very unusual station, being located entirely on a tight curve and on a 1 in 50 gradient. It was another infill station, opened about a year after the line, and was originally just named Flemington, but became Flemington Bridge just 8 months later, possibly to avoid confusion with the already well-established station nearby at Flemington Racecourse. Flemington Bridge has quite nice weatherboard buildings and is surrounded by peppercorn trees, a species introduced from South America and favoured by the Victorian Railways for station planting. Apparently, in the mid-20th century, the Victorian Railways didn't allow female employees to work at Flemington Bridge because its elevated position gave it a view over the rear entrance to a funeral parlour, which is still the case today, and it was considered that a woman might become distraught by seeing such activity and not adequately cope with her duties. This seems a particularly surprising policy here of all places, as this was far from the only place on the Upfield line one would be likely to see a coffin, as we will discover a bit later on. In the 1890s, there was a proposal to build a spur line from here about 6 kilometres along the Moonee Ponds Creek to connect with the northeast line at Pascoe Vale, which is pretty much the alignment the freeway takes today. It would have had 3 stations and also served as another alternative route for more flexibility, but nothing ever came of it. Beyond the station, the line continues to climb on a large steel bridge over Mount Alexander Road and Tram Route 59. Despite the triangle of transit formed by the Upfield line and the tram routes at each end, the connections between Flemington Bridge Station and either tram route are thoroughly unimpressive. Walking to the 59 isn't too bad, although it does involve crossing 9 lanes of traffic. However, it's the pedestrian connection to the 57 that really leaves a lot to be desired. There are only ramps accessing the railway station at the northern end, and there's no way to walk along the eastern side of the station towards Racecourse Road. So despite the up end of the platforms only being about 30 metres from the tram line, the most direct pedestrian route is about 230 metres. Beyond the Mount Alexander Road bridge, the line continues to climb, crossing another small bridge over Manningham Street, then temporarily leaving developed suburbia. For the next 1.8 kilometres, the line winds scenically through Royal Park, a large area of parkland and native bush just over 3 kilometres from the CBD, and quite a contrast to the underneath freeway scenery just 500 metres back towards the city. The line passes through the park in big sweeping curves, first through a cutting and then on an embankment on the approach to Royal Park Station. Just before the station, the line passes over the Route 58 tram line, which passes through the park on its own meandering alignment and is by far the longest section of off-street tramway in Melbourne. This is probably the most iconic train over tram seen on the network, and with a bit of luck, skill and patience you can photograph it yourself. Or, The line then passes over Poplar Road, which is a bit unusual in that it's part of the circuit on the Royal Park golf course, so you'll frequently see golf carts crossing here, and it's probably the second most likely place in the country to see a golf cart versus train collision, after the Grange line in Adelaide. It's also another good spot to photograph trains and trams in the same scene, and you'll be pleased to know I did in fact get the timing right in this spot and didn't have to fake it. Immediately beyond the level crossing is Royal Park Station, which consists of a pair of straight parallel platforms in between the curves through the park. The weatherboard station is quite substantial, and there's a disused signal box at the up end of the up platform. The main reason this station exists is to serve Melbourne Zoo, which occupies a large area of the park to the south of here. The zoo actually predates the railway by a considerable margin, first opening in 1862. In the early days, the animals would have been housed in pretty poor conditions, like this old cage which has been left as a display. But today the zoo is a world-class facility with spacious enclosures, a huge variety of species, and a big focus on wildlife conservation. While the main entrance to the zoo is at the other end, there is a second entrance located close to the station, so it's easy to access when you arrive by either train or tram. This is well recognised by the zoo, and the entrance is marked as the Rail Gate on maps. Their website also does a great job of emphasising that rail is the best way to get there, both listing it as the first option and specifically stating that it's the best mode of travel. The signs at Royal Park list their major nearby attraction hyphenated with the station name, and there's only one other place on the network done in that same style. Back in the ancient times of the Metlink era, the signs also had various animals on them, but sadly they weren't carried over to the current design. Apparently this line was originally going to run to the east of the zoo, but when earthworks started in 1882, locals objected to it cutting through that part of the park, and the alignment was altered to what we see today. Departing Royal Park, the line pitches back up into a 1 in 50 grade and climbs through a deep cutting. Between 1888 and 1981, there was a junction here, and you can clearly see on satellite imagery where the Inner Circle Railway branched off. This line led about 3 kilometres across the inner north to a triangular junction between Rushall and Merry on what was then the Whittlesea line, now the Mernda line. In fact, before 1901, this was the only connection between the Clifton Hill Group lines and the city, as you'll know from my Hurstbridge line video. And I just happened to have this 125-year-old timetable showing trains to Heidelberg via Royal Park. While through traffic ceased in 1965, there was a short branch to Fitzroy, and that line stayed open until 1981, although it was only for goods traffic in later years. Back at Royal Park, there's still plenty of evidence of the junction. You can see both the cutting and the overhead wire gantries are wide enough for the additional tracks. The spot where the inner circle left the cutting has been filled in, but just beyond there is a surviving overhead gantry on the line, and there are plenty of other relics to see along the way. Today it's a popular linear park and rail trail, so while it could be argued that it would be nice to have trains running here again, the alignment is certainly still serving as an important link for the community. At the end of the cutting, the line levels out and passes over Park Street, then abruptly changes character almost completely. We have now entered the suburb of Brunswick, which the line slices neatly down the middle for the next 2.5 kilometres. This is now dense residential suburbia, and a typical example of old inner Melbourne, with numerous rows of attractive old terrace houses. The railway and bike track share a narrow corridor between the buildings, and like it or not, there's plenty of graffiti. At least some of it's topical. Now, before we go any further, we need to take a step back and add a bit more context for this next section. The line between here and Coburg originally had extremely frequent level crossings. In fact, the next crossing after Park Street is just 100 metres further north. Before automatic boom gates, busy level crossings were protected by interlocked gates, which were manually opened and closed by a gatekeeper who worked out of a little building next to the crossing. When there was no train due, the gates were swung open blocking the railway, and they were protected by semaphore signals also operated by the gatekeeper. These pictures are from the New Street crossing down in Brighton, which was the only set of suburban interlocked gates to survive into the 21st century. But aside from New Street, the Upfield line was famously the last holdout of this type of infrastructure, and right into the mid-90s, all the level crossings through Brunswick, as well as several in Coburg, were protected by interlocked gates and semaphores. While this type of gate is actually safer than a modern boom gate, because cars physically can't get past them, the downside is that they stay closed to road traffic for a longer time, and you have to pay someone to staff each and every one of them, and you can imagine how much the railways enjoyed doing that. In 1976, the Victorian Railways was spending $216,000 a year employing 20 gatekeepers, which works out approximately as a very reasonable $80,000 each in 2024 money. By the 1990s, there was still something like 13 sets of interlocked gates between Royal Park and Coburg, and numerous semaphore signals, some of which apparently were still lit by kerosene lamps, which had to be attended to on a regular basis. Upfield had always been one of the quieter lines on the network, and now that the railways were operating in an era where they actually had to pay staff decent union wages, pressure began to build to either upgrade the infrastructure or close the line for good. In fact, the threat of closure loomed over this line for about 20 years. Firstly in the 80s due to economic concerns, ignoring its social value of course, then accompanied by a push to convert the line to light rail, and leading into further pressure when construction of CityLink began in the 90s. It would have been a lot easier to build the freeway if the railway just went away. The story of the attempted Upfield line closures is an entire topic in its own right and goes well beyond what I'm going to cover in this video. But the main thing you need to know is that each attempt was thwarted by major community opposition, with highly organised demonstrations attracting many thousands of people. Community action saved the Upfield line, there's no question about it. So in 1995, the plans for closure were finally abandoned and the line was upgraded instead, receiving electronic signalling along the whole line. All the interlocked gates were replaced with boom gates, and some level crossings were closed to road traffic completely. A lot of this infrastructure was very historic, and the majority of structures through Brunswick and Coburg were listed by the National Trust in 1989, so much of it survives intact today, alongside the modern equipment. Most of the gates were left in position but swung out the way, the gatekeepers' huts were left more or less untouched, and the semaphore signals were rotated 90 degrees so they no longer faced approaching trains. Some of the surviving semaphore signals have wooden posts, which seem to survive much later on this line than anywhere else. The other significant thing you need to know about this section of line is that it runs parallel to Sydney Road, about 200 metres to the east, which is a very busy place and Brunswick's main shopping strip. Crucially, it's also the route taken by the Route 19 tram, which provides a complementary service to the railway, better suited for short distance trips within Brunswick and Coburg. It also provides an excellent alternative for rail passengers when trains are disrupted, and despite taking a few minutes longer to get to the city, it's still miles better than sticking around to wait for a replacement bus. Okay, so back to Park Street. This level crossing is typical of many along the line today, with an old gatekeeper's hut as well as the interlocked gates themselves still in place, along with some white picket fencing. 100 metres further on is Brunswick Road, where the hut survived but not the gates for some reason. Now we're only about 140 metres from the next station, Jewell, but there's still time for one more level crossing, or at least there was in the past. Barclay Street is one of the crossings that was closed permanently instead of getting an upgrade, so the road has been ripped up, but the gates and huts still stand, with the gates closed across the old road alignment. Fortunately, there's still a pedestrian crossing here, which is fitted with modern automatic gates. Jewell Station features a large, attractive brick building, one of several on the line known as the Moreland type, I assume because the design was originally drawn up for Moreland Station, which opened in the same year, and still stands today on the Victorian Goldfields Railway. Jewell Station opened as South Brunswick, being renamed to Jewell in 1954 after a former Brunswick councillor and later Member of Parliament, James Jewell. Before he got into politics, James was a butcher and owned no fewer than 3 butcher shops in the area, Some sources also say he drove steam engines for a bit in the 1890s, but from what I can see this was just in an industrial capacity for a firm which built meatpacking equipment, so he wasn't actually a railwayman. Immediately at the down end of the station is another level crossing over Union Street, this time with the gateposts intact but not the actual gates. This crossing was controlled from a full-size signal box, which was needed here as it also controlled a couple of goods sidings, which once ran along the west side of the line here, and you can see a surviving wooden buffer right next to Union Street. Just beyond the next level crossing, Dawson Street, there's an unusually shaped building curving away from the line, which is, incidentally, the booze bus depot. If you look on the satellite imagery, it's obvious this is an old rail alignment. This was a siding which served the Hoffman Brickworks, which was located about 600 metres from the main line. The brickworks closed long ago, but many of the buildings still survive, converted for residential use. Just next to the big curvy building is a pedestrian footbridge, which provides an excellent vantage point to watch or photograph trains. The footbridge clearly dates from the time when the sidings were still here, as it's more than 2 tracks wide, and in fact the sidings were probably the reason this location got a footbridge, so pedestrians could still get through while shunting operations were taking place. On the other side of the line here is the Brunswick Baths, featuring an Olympic swimming pool, a good place to go for a swim if you also want to listen to the sounds of passing trains. Immediately beyond the footbridge is another fully closed level crossing with surviving gates, Phoenix Street, and again you can see the space where the sidings would have been. There's one more level crossing, Albert Street, with a gatekeeper's hut, then we're up at Brunswick Station. Very similar to Jewell, Brunswick has a modern style building on the up platform. At the down end of the station is another disused signal box right next to, you guessed it, another level crossing, Victoria Street. The line then continues running along its narrow alignment with buildings either side. This path beside the line is the uninspiringly named Upfield Shared Path, which is the same path that's been paralleling the line ever since Macaulay. Despite being quite narrow, the path is very heavily used, including by a large number of people who commute by bike to the city from here. If you can time your ride to run alongside a train, you won't have to wait to cross any of the roads, and it's possible to keep pace with trains along here for several kilometres. I've made a separate video where I raced a train all the way through Brunswick, so make sure you check that out if you haven't seen it already. There's another level crossing with Hope Street before we arrive at the final station in Brunswick, Anstey. This station opened much later than the others in this area in 1926 and was originally called North Brunswick, but similar to Jewell, it was renamed in 1942 after Frank Anstey, another local politician. It shows how different the political climate was at the time that it was considered a good idea to rename 2 sensibly geographic station names after 2 former politicians. The station building is at the far down end of the up platform, right next to the Albion Street level crossing. This is also a great example of high-density housing surrounding a station, and the area between the platform and the apartment buildings has been sensibly pedestrianised. The previous 2 stations also have elements of this, but I think Anstey is the best example. On the down platform just near the building is this lovely survivor, the 5 mile post, which is the only remaining imperial measurement post on the line that I've noticed. Continuing north, the line passes over one more former level crossing at Tinning Street, with gates and hut all still in place. Towering over the line here are a pair of disused silos, part of the old Brunswick plaster mill. The silos were used to store gypsum, which was railed all the way from Newinji in far northwest Victoria. Today, the silos feature a huge mural by artist Loretta Lizzo. The painting is based on a well-known photograph of former New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern shortly after the 2019 Christchurch massacre. It's my personal opinion that this is a very odd choice of imagery for a Melbourne silo mural. It's a very personal image taken in a time of extreme grief shortly after a terror attack 2,500 kilometres away in another country, and as far as I'm aware, the identity and personal circumstance of the second person is unknown. But, art is subjective. Opposite the silos on the other side of the line, there are visible remains of several industrial sidings leading into various buildings, including this old bluestone grain store. I'm guessing this was only usable by short 4-wheel wagons, given the tight radius curve through the narrow doorway. The building has now been converted for residential use, which I think looks pretty cool. The line then leaves the suburb of Brunswick behind, and also the ground, as it rises up on a concrete elevated skyrail structure, which soars above the suburbs for the next 2 and a bit kilometres. This section was elevated by the level crossing removal project in 2020, eliminating 4 level crossings and requiring a complete rebuild of 2 stations. Partway up the ramp, passengers get a good view of the Brunswick Tram depot, which houses the trams and drivers that operate routes 1, 6 and 19.
We're now arriving at Moreland.
The first station on the new elevated section is Moreland, which is not a suburb name. We are now in the suburb of Coburg. The station is named after Moreland Road, which was named after a local landholding, which was named after a Jamaican slave estate. In 2022, the local government area, then known as Moreland City Council, decided to change their name to eliminate the slavery connection, becoming Marybeck City Council, meaning rocky country in the indigenous Woiwurrung language. However, for the moment at least, the road and station retained the Moreland name. From the newly elevated platforms, there's a fantastic view back towards the city, and a great place to photograph trains with the CBD forming an impressive backdrop. The Route 6 tram terminus is close to the station, located on the track running into Brunswick Depot. Underneath the structure, some of the historic ground level infrastructure has survived. The signal box next to Moreland Road has been beautifully restored, along with another semaphore signal. The station building, another Malden type, is still in place, along with this tiny version of itself. In front of the building is a sunken garden bed featuring some remnant track, although it's not actually in its original position. Like most of Melbourne's Skyrail sections, the entire area underneath the elevated structure has been repurposed as public space, and I think it looks really good. The bike path has been made significantly wider, and in some sections now has separate lanes for bikes and pedestrians. While the new standard of path is certainly a welcome change, one thing I've heard from several people is that the travel time is now generally longer, because there's no longer the advantage of getting a clear run across roads while level crossings are activated. Beyond Moreland, the line maintains elevation all the way to Coburg, which was the original terminus of the line when it opened in 1884. The new Coburg station is architecturally striking and really stands out from the other recent station builds, even earning itself an article in one of Australia's most reputable newspapers. However, like most stations built by the project, the design effort is mostly aimed at the view from ground level, and the actual platforms are pretty generic and grey. Like Moreland, the brick station building survives underneath and is the fourth and final example of a Malden-type building on this line. Before the line was elevated, there was an old signal box next to the Munro Street level crossing. However, this was demolished during the project, despite heritage listing and opposition from the community. I'm guessing it didn't clear the new structure. The foundations remain in place, presented as a sort of public display. Also at ground level is this attractive brick substation, built in 1933 to reduce voltage sag on the outer part of the line, which had originally been powered from a single substation at North Fitzroy back on the Inner Circle line. On the east side of the line is a former supermarket, now a gigantic art studio, which was built in 1982 and really reflects the attitudes of the time, showing an entirely blank wall to the railway station with no entrance. At the time it was built, the line's closure probably seemed like a virtual certainty, but it's still a bad bit of design that is annoying to the present day. At the northern end of the station is one of Melbourne's most unpleasant stroads, Bell Street, which does carry several important bus routes, including the 903 orbital route. Given the value of this connection, it's a shame they didn't put a second entrance to the platforms on the north side of the road here, allowing interchanging passengers grade-separated access. So now that you've seen what the elevated sections look like, I need to mention that the entire line all the way back to Jewell is supposed to receive this treatment in the next few years, which will eliminate a further 8 level crossings. I have kind of mixed feelings about this. While the new stations and public space generated are undeniably impressive, I will certainly miss the character of this piece of old Melbourne, and being able to walk or ride right alongside the trains. Although at the time of writing, there's some talk of postponing or cancelling this project due to budget cuts. Coburg was the end of the line for 5 years until 1889, when it was extended about 11 kilometres north to Somerton, near today's Roxburgh Park station on the Craigieburn line. This allowed the line via Coburg to be used as an alternative route for trains on the North East Main Line, and also allowed goods traffic bound for the industries around Brunswick and Coburg to come in directly from the northeast. However, this section of the line would have a very checkered history of closure and reopening, and is still partially abandoned to this day. It closed completely north of Coburg in 1903, just 14 years after opening, but then reopened as far as Fawkner just 3 years later for some special traffic, which we'll discuss when we get there. In 1914, a proper suburban service returned to Fawkner, along with the reopening and renaming of some intermediate stations. After Coburg, the elevated line drops back down to ground level and passes over O'Hay Street? I don't know, probably O'Hay Street, I guess, on the level. Now, if you've watched my Hurstbridge Line video, you'll remember I used a lot of diagrams showing the track layouts at major stations. This hasn't really been necessary in this video so far because there hasn't been a single junction, siding or crossover since all the way back at Macaulay. But there is a crossover here, located about halfway between Coburg and the next station, Batman. This allows trains to terminate short during disruptions, with down trains able to reverse direction at Batman, and up trains can do the same thing at Coburg using the same crossover. In fact, the whole track layout of the Upfield line is so simple, I reckon I can draw the entire thing beyond Macaulay in under 10 seconds. Batman Station is located just beyond the Gaffney Street level crossing. It has a weatherboard building combined with a disused signal box at the far southern end of the platform. The building used to look quite nice from the platform, but the view is now blocked by a PSO pod. Prior to the 1903 closure, there was a station on this site called Bell Park, but when it reopened in 1914, it was named Batman, not after the DC superhero, but after John Batman, the man widely regarded as the father of Melbourne. The only thing we're really taught about John in school is that he purchased the land Melbourne now stands on from the Wurundjeri people in exchange for various items, including blankets, handkerchiefs, knives, and flour. What the Victorian curriculum failed to mention, however, is that prior to that, he had been an enthusiastic participant in the murder and displacement of First Nations people in Tasmania. Personally, I think I would have stuck with Bell Park. North of Batman, the line has an unusually wide track centre, with a central line of single poles supporting the overhead wires on both sides. These are the original poles from 1920, installed when the line was just single track here, what is today the down line. When the section between Coburg and Fawkner was duplicated in 1959, the new upline was unusually positioned to make use of the existing poles. The other slightly odd thing here is this very prominent dip in the line, with a 1 in 50 grade on both sides. Before the Skyrail, the climb on the Batman side of this dip was the only real climb facing up trains on the entire line. We're now in the suburb of Coburg North, and it's obviously a community keen on gardening, with much of the line side planted out with natives as well as community gardens, some more official than others, and lots of creatively reused objects. Next up we have Merlynston, which, much like Batman, is an island platform with the building at one end, although this one is a bit uglier, made of cement bricks. In the early iteration of the line, this station was called North Coburg, and it kept that name at the 1914 reopening. But in 1922, in true Upfield line style, it was renamed after the two daughters of a local landholder, Merle and Lynn. Merle and Lynn's town, Merlynston. Sounds like something I'd name a town in Transport Tycoon. Although another reference suggests that it was just one daughter called Merlin, so who knows. The area to the east of the station isn't being used very efficiently given its close proximity to good public transport, and is largely occupied by car parks, car dealerships, and a large self-storage facility. However, on the western side there's a nice little park and shopping strip, a very typical mid-20th century suburban scene. After Merlynston, the line crosses Boundary Road and changes character once again, suddenly surrounded by gum trees. For the next 1.6 kilometres, the line runs alongside and partially through the Fawkner Cemetery. Partway along here is Fawkner Station, which has pretty unremarkable buildings. In fact, I'm not sure if you can actually call this one a building. But it does have a very interesting history. An unusual distinction here is that many of the passengers who arrived at this station in the early 20th century, between 1906 and 1939, are still here. This is because during that time, new residents to the Fawkner Cemetery arrived by rail. Special mortuary trains ran from a dedicated platform at Flinders Street. Passengers bound for their ultimate destination were transported in specially designed hearse cars, which were attached to a normal stopping all stations train to Fawkner. So relatives of the deceased could come along for the ride, as well as anyone else going that direction. Corpses were also allowed to be loaded at Macaulay and Brunswick. I'm not sure why those two stations specifically. Deceased passengers didn't require a ticket from suburban destinations, however there was a limit to this generosity and you did have to pay if your loved one was being forwarded from a country station. After electrification in 1920, the hearse cars were fitted with through multiple unit cables, allowing them to be positioned in the middle of a suburban electric set, and apparently this was usually a 4-car swing door train. One of the hearse cars, 7J, was restored in 1993 and now sits on display in the cemetery, with easy public access being a short distance from the platforms. For a moment, I thought it was a bit odd that pretty much all references to these vehicles refer to them as hearse cars, despite car, carriage, usually meaning a passenger-carrying vehicle in Victorian Railways language. And it really should be described as a hearse van, but then again, I'm not sure it's really a goods vehicle either. If you want to learn more about this interesting service, and also impress your friends as the owner of an extremely niche interest book, you can pick these up very cheap from the Newport Railway Museum. The original line did have a Fawkner station, but it was located a bit further north. When the line reopened in 1906, exclusively for traffic to the newly opened cemetery, the newly built station was called Fawkner Cemetery. However, with the return of normal services in 1914, it returned to the shorter name. Fawkner remained the end of the line until 1928, when community pressure resulted in the return of an extremely basic passenger service between here and the junction at Somerton. This was operated by a tiny 45 horsepower 4-wheel AEC rail motor, which gained the local nickname of the Beetle. The Beetle connected with electric trains at Fawkner and departed from the yard rather than the platform, with passengers boarding from ground level. The rail motor had a high-level door for normal platforms, as well as a low-level door with a step. Some very basic stations were built near former stations at Campbelfield and North Campbelfield, featuring low-level platforms and small waiting sheds. There were also a number of officially designated rail motor stopping places, although according to this article from The Age, it would also stop wherever a head bobs up. Apparently some of the stopping places were completely fenced off from nearby roads, with no means of access other than climbing over the fence. The Beetle was single-ended and was turned at each end of the line on a small hand-operated turntable, often enthusiastically assisted by passengers. There was no rail connection to the North East line at Somerton at this time, with the line from Fawkner simply ending at the turntable. Despite the singular nickname, the Beetle wasn't always the exact same rail motor. The VR built 19 AEC rail motors, and they were regularly rotated for maintenance. However, most pictures from the time show 9RM in service at Fawkner, with 7RM being another regular. When no AEC was available, the line was also occasionally operated by a Walker rail motor. By the mid-50s, the line was bleeding money and the Beetle was getting old, with the Transport Minister of the time describing it as a prehistoric monster, and an attempt was made to close the line once more. However, the government didn't count on the passion of the line's residents, and 300 of them converged on the tiny Campbelfield station to defend their motor train bus, which is a pretty impressive turnout for a rail motor with just 32 seats. This was a time when many working-class families still didn't own cars, and these people really depended on this minimalist rail service to get around. While the concept of having a favourite Beetle was still 7 or 8 years in the future, it's clear that the people of Campbelfield had already chosen theirs. The community effort managed to hold off closure for just over a year, but in May 1956, the line finally closed once more, and the Beetle became a portable shed on a nearby property. Sadly, there are no known remains of this or any other AEC rail motor today. But a lot of new industries were being built in the Campbelfield area, and just 3 years later, in 1959, the line reopened again with a connection to the northeast, allowing access to goods trains once more. At the same time, the electrification and passenger service was extended to a new station at Upfield, about 2.5 kilometres short of the junction, which we'll come back to because we're not actually finished with Fawkner yet. On the downside of Fawkner Station is a level crossing, which looks largely conventional from a railway point of view, but is actually an internal cemetery road leading from the main entrance. This is within the cemetery gates, so is an unusual case where outside opening hours there'll be no road traffic here. For the next few hundred metres, the line is very much within the cemetery, with graves on both sides. However, there's a narrow strip of public land between the railway and the cemetery fence on the western side, and while it doesn't look like much on a map, walking along the path there feels surprisingly remote, and gives a little insight into what this area would have looked like pre-development, with open grassland dotted with river red gums. The original pre-closure Fawkner station was actually located here somewhere, although I don't think there's any visible evidence of it. One last little fact about this section, neither the Fawkner Cemetery or Fawkner Station are located in the suburb of Fawkner. They're in a suburb I'd never heard of until writing this, Hadfield. Actual Fawkner is over on the other side of Sydney Road. Speaking of which, on the far side of Sydney Road, directly opposite the station, is a well-placed tombstone manufacturing business, which features this unusual artefact. That is a repurposed 1920s railway overhead wiring pole, and the reason I point it out is that despite thousands of these existing all over the city for the past 100 years, this is the only place I've ever seen one reused for a non-railway purpose. Returning to an area where most people are alive, the line crosses Box Forest Road and immediately becomes a lot less attractive as we approach Gowrie. Gowrie is surrounded by car yards, crash repair centres, more tombstone manufacturers, and an alarmingly large Krispy Kreme donuts. It's an island platform with a timber building, and there's a sort of desolate bus stop on the dead-end road on the western side, where the 527 and 536 buses terminate. And while I don't normally photograph buses on purpose, there was a brand new locally built battery bus there during my visit. The first station existed on this site during the Beetle era and was called Rail Motor Stopping Place No. 21. The current station with the current name opened in 1965, a few years after the reopening to Upfield. Despite now being nearly 15 kilometres from the city by rail, the CBD is still clearly visible in the distance. Gowrie is the end of the double track, with the junction being just on the downside of the station. The line from here to the end of the line at Upfield is by far the longest distance between two stations on the whole line, at just over 4 kilometres, and is the only place where trains can really maintain the 80 km/h line speed for an extended distance. For the 800 metres or so out of Gowrie, the line is fairly isolated, running along behind a bunch more car yards and warehouses, but the railway is lined with trees, so actually looks quite nice. It then crosses over the M80 Ring Road, on a bridge which has been built wide enough for a second track to be added one day, which you can think about as you look down at the 11 lanes of traffic below. This is actually the first bridge we've crossed since the one over the tram line all the way back in Royal Park. In fact, the Upfield line really only has 5 bridges, not counting the Skyrail, and none of them pass over any significant amount of water. In fact, I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying this is the only Melbourne suburban line which doesn't pass over any named rivers or creeks. Just after the freeway, the line dives down to pass under Camp Road, a former level crossing which was separated in 2017. While most rail undercrossing removals end up as a concrete trench, this one has unusually been left as an open dirt cutting. This was the former site of Campbelfield Station, which existed here at the original line opening and again in a slightly different spot during the Beetle era. There have been various proposals over the years to reinstate a station here for the 3rd time, which would make a lot of sense as it's in the middle of the long gap between Gowrie and Upfield. It would be a useful bus interchange point as there are 3 routes nearby, including the 902 orbital route, and there's a medium-sized shopping centre not far away, although it would likely be a pretty annoying walk from any station. I think to make a new station properly worthwhile, it would need to be built surrounded by some new transit-oriented development and include a bit of a renewal of the surrounding area. The last few kilometres of the line winds unscenically past industrial buildings, opening up into low-density residential, with the railway finally running down a nice green corridor, then crossing the Barry Road level crossing and arriving into Upfield Station, which is an unremarkable single platform with 4 stabling sidings at the down end. Upfield isn't a suburb. The station is located on the border of Campbelfield and Coolaroo. The station also existed here in the previous 2 eras and was called North Campbelfield. Allegedly the name Upfield is a contraction of Upper Campbelfield, and I have no idea why they went with that rather than just calling it North Campbelfield again. Aside from the residential area south of Barry Road, Upfield is mostly surrounded by industry, or former industry. The large site to the northeast of the station is the former Ford factory, and the station's original purpose was solely for employees of this factory, with trains only running at the start and end of each working day. Even today, the catchment area of this station is quite small, given Coolaroo Station on the Craigieburn line is only about 1,800 metres away. So that's the end of the line, for now at least. The remaining 2.5 kilometres to the junction with the North East Main Line at Somerton was last used in the 90s, but the track still remains in place, and is actually still connected to the end of one of the stabling sidings at Upfield. Interestingly, reaching Somerton via the Upfield line is just 60 metres longer than the route via Essendon. There was also a standard gauge connection from Somerton down to the Ford sidings, and this was laid as gauntlet track rather than dual gauge, where the 2 gauges overlap but don't share any rails. There is a proposal to eventually reopen the line back to the junction, probably in conjunction with electrification and extension of suburban trains to Wallen. However, there's no indication this will happen anytime soon. So that's pretty much it. Congratulations on making it through this rather long video. A big thanks to Alex Panini, who lent me this very helpful book, as well as some very detailed personal notes on the line. To Alexander Jamison, who brought the AEC Beetle to life in 1:24 scale, especially for this video. And also to my brother Kian, who put up with me sitting at his computer recording this voiceover for several hours. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon, which directly helps me dedicate time to making this content. And thank you very much for watching.
Now arriving at Upfield. This train will be terminating